Well, this episode is interesting combo. So we had somebody ask us a specific question that led to this episode, and it's also kind of a continuation of our last episode. So
Uh,
our last episode was,
it was Boys to Men,
and this episode is.
Boys and Knives.
So it's almost like we covered the well-known group Boys to Men from the
Mhm,
early '90s
mhm,
last week, and this week we're covering the lesser-known country group Boys and Knives.
mhm.
So that's not a country group, but it should be.
Mm,
I think they'd be very successful.
yeah.
So we had another father ask us a couple of weeks ago, what we did with pocket knives. How did we handle the whole pocket knife thing? And we've been down quite an interesting road with pocket knives, and so it just kind of got me thinking. Like I think we could offer some really practical help for parents when it comes not just to knives and not just to boys, but to kind of how you deal with the whole weapons thing, knives, guns, all that kind of stuff. And our goal is to give you some really practical, like what age did we do what thing kind of advice today.
Yeah, and there will be a few biblical concepts that will surface in the discussion as well, but this one is more of a practical conversation that, we it's on the hearts and minds of some of our friends as parents, and so we just thought we would talk about that and see if our conversation might be of help.
It's interesting because this is the Christ centered life. So we always try to think, okay, if Jesus were in the center of the universe, of our universe, and then this thing we're talking about, whether it's immigration or politics or marriage, dating, whatever, that what would it look like if it were orbiting the center of a solar system where Jesus is at the center of it? It's just really hard to think like pocket knives.
Right.
Like, how would pocket knives orbit in the Jesus solar system?
But there are some bigger umbrella concepts that do orbit, the centricity of Christ and how we deal with certain things, how we think through topics like this, how we make our decisions as parents and protect our children and guide our children and lead our children. So some of those things definitely would apply, but the specific undertone of pocket knives might not
Sure.
necessarily
And we want to
be
say
there.
from the beginning, we're speaking mainly to people in the cultural South. We're based out of Mobile, Alabama. I know we have a lot of listeners that are outside of the cultural South, and it this may not apply to you because every culture really is different when it comes to these things.
Right. Context matters greatly.
And that idea of we want to be careful about that like idea of cultural superiority. We love the Southern culture. I'm so glad that my boys get to grow up in a place where they're exposed properly to, knives and guns and things like that. But we've lived in a culture where it was frankly more difficult to do that. We
Right.
knew very few people who actually had ever even touched a firearm or seen a firearm. And so I guess I just want, if you're outside of the cultural South, I want you to kind of lay aside maybe some stereotypes you have and just listen in, and you might find something that would be helpful for you and your family. If you're inside the cultural South, don't judge them too harshly because they don't interact with guns and pocket knives and that kind of thing as much in other cultures. We've been in some international cultures where really it would be quite a rebellious thing
Mhm.
to really promote this with your children. So I think there's a lot of cultural nuance that comes along here that we have to think through
Yeah.
in this.
Mhm.
So, but with that said, so we want to kind of go from this direction. All right, is this something you should do? And then, if so, kind of went some practical nuts and bolts of when and how.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with that question of if
Right.
should you should you allow your children to be exposed to guns and knives and things like that?
Yeah. So I'll say just from the mom's perspective, and then maybe you can share from the dad's perspective on this. That question of should in our context and for our family, it's really funny to me. Even when we lived in Miami and we were not really surrounded by a lot of people who had guns or pocket knives, it wasn't a part of, you didn't, it wasn't a normal thing to see men and boys carrying around those things in Miami. But even still, just with our love for Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, like there is a part of our boys, particularly all of our children to some extent, but particularly our boys, there's a part of them that just comes alive when they're pretending and playing sword fighting, or you look at a stick that's L-shaped and it's immediately a gun for a boy. So a stick can become a sword or a knife when they're playing and imagining outside. So from the mom's perspective, I've seen our children at very young ages playing, role playing outside or even in the house with toys, fighting or war, or even just pretending to be a police officer, or those different types of things where that might be a part of the role. I see them doing that, even though that wasn't something that they saw all the time. It's not like we constantly watch Star Wars or constantly watch Lord of the Rings. I mean, those things were just things that they had been lightly exposed to, but there was something in them that desired to play that out to a certain extent. So there's that aspect of it, the imagination that comes alive in it. Even if they never had a pocket knife, they've got things in nature that they're picking up and creating them
Yeah,
just
I
like
think,
that.
and we want to be again very sensitive to cultures where, boy, gun violence is just kind of a constant thing. We've been spared from that, even when we lived and where we lived in Miami. We were spared from that. There were other parts of town that were just very different from where we lived,
Hmm.
and so you can easily see how a kid picking up a stick and pretending it is a gun would not be necessarily a healthy thing
Right.
in certain contexts and cultures. And but for us, we've never been in that place. And the kind of the funny thing, you and I have talked about this a lot. Hey, let's make sure, if we said, we never said this, but if we said, hey, let's try to make sure that there's no swords in the house, there's no guns in the house, that we're not going to do that. Well, it's good luck.
Right.
I mean, they just
The empty wrapping paper tube that I have in
sure.
my bedroom right now, Marshall is ready on G and waiting on go O for me to give it to him to turn it into a lightsaber.
Sure.
So, but I will say this, something that we have stressed from the beginning with them when they are playing and role playing that way is we don't pretend to shoot people.
Right.
And even when they're pretending it's a gun, they're pretending it's a blaster from like a stormtrooper
Yeah.
blaster or Han Solo's blaster, or we say we don't pretend to shoot at people, even with Nerf guns. Like we don't aim it at people's faces. We
I
don't,
was going to say they shoot at a lot of people with Nerf guns,
right,
but we do say don't shoot in the face and that kind of. And hey, if we kind of do an eye for an eye thing, if they shoot somebody who wasn't playing or whatever, then the other person gets a free shot at them.
right.
So
And we
you've
were we were also intentional with language with them. So if they were playing Nerf guns, or if they were shooting, playing with each other, we would say, "Don't say you killed him. Say
right,
you got him. I
yeah,
got him." We're not pretending to kill people. We're
right.
not pretending in that way. And so we were intentional from the beginning with that language,
And I
just so
think
they
I
knew the
think that comes
difference.
to some of the how that we'll get to later
Mhm.
on the language. The language
Mhm.
that you use is important. What you say about it, and then how you even talk about play guns, and then as you get into to real guns, if that's something your family chooses to do, I think that's very important. I wanted to kind of get like just a barometer. You and I have talked about it a little bit. Your experience growing up,
Mhm.
very different than my experience because your dad was a pastor. Y'all moved around a lot. Of course, you were a girl, so uh, not as much cultural expectation that you would hunt and that kind of thing. But what
Mhm.
was your do you remember the first time you shot a gun?
I think it was when we were married.
After I wondered if that was it. We were married, we went to the
The
range,
range, yeah.
and you shot a couple guns. I was thinking that was it.
Yeah.
So,
I don't remember shooting one before then.
I believe I shot a real gun, not a BB gun. I believe the first time I shot a real gun that I was six years old,
Okay.
a rifle. And my dad took me out and we shot a rifle. Probably it was a 22. I don't really remember, but I'll come back to that story later because I think it's important for the how. But there were lots of guns in our house, and it was kind of a. It wasn't something we talked about all the time. It was just something that was just part of not only my life but every other family that I knew. It was just kind of a part of the culture. So it's interesting, even living in the same county,
Mhm.
how different your experience can be. Now, Pastor Brent, our missions pastor, he and I, we like to. He says all the time, the more you share with me about your high school experience, the more I realize that our two experiences at school couldn't have been more different from one another.
Mhm.
So at my school, routinely, the teachers would ask if any of the students had a pocket knife, not for a security check, but because they needed a pocket
They
knife.
needed something to be
And
opened.
so, if at the school that I went to, I mean, I can remember a day when a teacher was like, "Hey, any of you boys got a pocket knife?" And like, it's like six pocket knives come out at the same time, and so that was pretty common. I'm sure it was probably a rule that we weren't supposed to have them at school. It was not an enforced rule, and it was very common for a boy to have a pocket knife at our school. And so, and not just pocket knives.
I was gonna say, are you gonna tell us about the time that the state came to
Yeah, I
visit?
think I think 30 years is long
I
enough.
think the statutes of limitations have
Yeah.
passed here.
So I went to one school system for middle school, and then I transferred to another school system for high school, and so I'm a proud graduate of Sardis High School. Those of you who were there in the '90s, you will have zero problems believing what I'm about to tell you. Those of you who are listening to this right now, you're going to think I'm making this up. This is 100% true. So I went like the first week or two that I was there. Our principal came over for the morning announcements, and he said, as a part of his morning announcements, we have visitors here from the state. You remember that in
Oh,
school?
yeah.
Hey, today we have visitors from the state. And so we've got visitors coming from the state today. If you have a rifle in the gun rack of your truck, would you please go and put it behind your seat? Like, three people from my homeroom got up and walked out. It's like, well, all right then. So that was a pretty common thing. It was not a shock at all to see a deer rifle hanging in the gun rack of a truck
Right,
in the parking lot at the school I went to. Things, of course, have changed dramatically since
right.
then, even at that school. But that's just kind of the culture that I grew up in. Nobody had any fear of those things. Nobody was, just nobody thought about it in
Right.
any kind of dangerous way. And I will argue that it's actually one of the safest cultures in even when relating to weapons that you can be around. We'll again talk a little bit about that when we get to the how section.
Well, there was such a level of respect in that culture for the
Hmm.
weapons, and like you said, the intent of that weapon was not really as a weapon. It was
Right.
it was really more as a tool for hunting. But
Or
it's
even just for sport, like
right,
a collector's items.
right.
So people collect guns, they study guns, so it's just a different culture. It's hard to describe. Nobody goes to buy a gun thinking, well, I'll rob a store with this, I'll
Hmm.
join a gang with this, I'll take somebody's life with this.
Right.
That's not why people in my culture bought guns at all.
And that's what I was gonna say about, the guns that you grew up around in your home. A lot of those guns were your grandfather's guns,
Hmm.
and so and your dad and your grandfather both had, a very distinct love for history and for different, conflicts and wars over history, and so there's a fascination with, the weaponry that the men would have used in those different times and, more of a collector type mentality than,
I don't
anything
know that I
else.
have ever known two kinder, less violent men
Mm,
than my grandfather and my father.
mhm.
They're just not the kind of guys that you think of, going and picking a fight, talking about how they're going to rough somebody up. It's just not. My grandfather's passed away, but just never who he was, and not who my father was, not who my father is at all. So just wasn't a part of their thought process.
Mhm.
So I do want to say, when it comes to scripture, where do we go for this? So there's some ideas that come out of scripture. I just think we have to be really careful about them. So first of all, a lot of weapons in scripture. I mean, a lot of weapons in scripture. The the first murder took place in Genesis chapter 4. There were no, as far as we know, formed and shaped weapons,
Mhm.
and so Cain killed Abel without any weapons that we know of. But then as history unfolds, of course, there's swords, there's bows and arrows. I mean, there's all kinds of weapons. You get to the New Testament, and Jesus says two things that are often understood as conflicting each other, but I think if you just look carefully at the context, it seems pretty clear. So in Luke chapter 22, Jesus is getting ready to send the disciples up, go to his last day with them, and then he knows they're going to be without him after that, and then eventually they're going to be sent out. And he tells them, "Hey, earlier I told you don't worry about money and knapsacks and all that, but now actually you should go get those things. And if you've got any swords, bring them. If you don't, then you might need to go buy some. And they kind of collectively say, hey, we have two swords. We know Peter had one of those. We don't know who else had the other one. But Jesus says, okay, that's enough. So there's some idea there that might need them for self defense,
Mhm.
and that things might get a little difficult over the next few days. And Jesus says, you know, if you got them, bring them. I mean, that's kind of what he says. And then in another context, where not long after that, Matthew 26 records this. Peter pulls out a sword, cuts off the ear of Malchus. We all know he wasn't aiming for Malchus's ear; he was trying to split his head open. He cuts Malchus's ear off. Jesus tells him to put the sword up, and that's not how the kingdom of God will be advanced. So people see that as contradictory. I think it's just as crystal clear as it can be. We're not going to advance the kingdom of God by violence. So we don't put together armies and invade places and say, you all have to be Christians. That's been tried in the past. That's not the way to do evangelism. But there is a place for self defense and for a proper understanding of weapons. Now, what we're talking about would include self defense, but we're also just generally talking about guns that you would use for sport, for collecting, for hunting, things like that. So,
And pocket knives to open boxes,
right, pocket, yeah,
or as Sawyer likes to say, "woodling."
woodling. He likes to do some woodling. Get up on the front porch and do a little bit of woodling. In some cultures, ours is one of them. If you don't have a pocket knife, it's kind of like a knock on your manhood.
Right.
You know, in other cultures. So I remember we were in Miami and at staff meeting every once in a while, I would pull my pocket knife out and do something with it. Like we'd be in the middle of staff meeting and maybe I needed to open something or sharpen a pencil or whatever. So I pull the pocket knife out, use it, put it back up. And I remember one day, one of our staff members, he he was from Miami. He actually wasn't from Miami. He was from Costa Rica, but he was raised in Miami. And he said, "Man, every time you pull that pocket knife out, like I get nervous." It's like, what do you mean? He's like, I don't know. Like, why are you pulling that pocket knife out? I'm like, to use it. But in his context, you pull a pocket knife out, it's probably to rob somebody.
Right.
And I'm just going to give you a life lesson. If you're going to rob somebody in the state of Alabama, don't bring a pocket knife.
Right.
That might not go the way that you think it would go.
Right.
So I just don't think of robbing people with a pocket knife. That's just not what comes to my mind. So
No.
culture really matters here, I think,
Yeah.
quite a bit in context.
So how do we know when we should or if we should allow our children to have pocket knives or BB guns or, any of those types of things that might be hard to discern?
I think every family has to make its own decisions about this, but I would tell you, in the context of a loving family, take away any extenuating circumstances as far as being surrounded by a violent culture or anything like that, especially in the cultural South. I would say you would need a reason not to expose them to pocket knives as tools, and then guns as they get age appropriate, because I think it's a mistake to think that especially in a culture like ours, that they're not going to encounter those.
Mhm.
And I think it's even more dangerous not to expose them, because if you expose them properly and you train them on to respect these things, then I think that's actually the safer route.
Yeah, and that's what I've seen in our context. I have seen you model for our boys and our girls too, but for our children, how to use these things properly and to respect them. And then also when they're not using them properly, say, "Okay, give it to me." Like you're not mature enough to handle that right now. And so I know for you when you were in Boy Scouts growing up, you had something called a toting chip or toten chip.
Totem chip.
Toten chip.
Yeah. I
And
don't want to talk about it.
okay,
It makes me mad.
we don't have to share
Because
about
they
that.
they intentionally find a way. If you get your corner,
It's
they cut your
entrapment.
corners off. Yeah. So if you're not using a pocket knife properly, they cut your corners off, and if you lose all four corners, then the car gets ripped in two, and you can't carry a pocket knife anymore. And they entrap you to
Mhm.
get at least one corner off that totem chip. So
How
I don't
many
want to talk about
scars are on your body right now because of improper use of a pocket knife?
it. I think the question we should ask is how much productivity throughout the years has been enhanced by
Mhm.
my use of pocket
Mhm.
knives with the small sacrifice of a handful of scars here or there.
Okay.
I think
Okay.
that, and,
And one less wart.
And yes, one yeah, so I've one less, about 7.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did surgery on myself quite a bit, so, um, but yeah, so I've cut myself, I've got my scars, but that is part of
It
learning
is.
how quick things can get out of hand with a tool if you're not careful.
Absolutely. And, point in case, one of our children, not even with a pocket knife, but with my craft X-Acto knife, cut
Sure.
himself in such a way that was not a good situation. So, they will find a way. But you have done such a great job of over and over again modeling for them the proper uses of these things, the importance of these things, and the way that these things can be enjoyed, I think about the BB guns that our children have had and how they've enjoyed being able to do target practice outside and those kinds of things. And it does bring a lot of fun to the family to be able to have those things to do with one another.
So let's kind of roll into the how because we're hitting on a lot of the hows here. How do you do this? And we'll get to like some really practical things about ages, but obviously safety is huge. So you want to overemphasize safety.
Mhm.
Let's talk first about pocket knives. Um, Let me come back to one why. Why would you do this? So, cutting yourself with a pocket knife. Here's what happens. Here's how almost everybody cuts themselves, one way or the other. Either they end up trying to cut toward their own body,
Mhm.
and I've got a scar because of that. Or the knife closes on you,
Mhm.
and you have your finger in the wrong place, and I
Mhm.
have a scar because of that. Now that's bad. I mean, and one of those scars I had to get stitches for, and but you know what it told me? You know what it taught me? Say those safety precautions, because you generally think, "Oh, safety rules are dumb."
Right.
I hear all those safety rules, but you realize when you cut toward yourself and you end up cutting yourself, or when the pocket knife closes on your finger and you cut yourself, you realize when I go to operate that table saw, and everybody tells me, "Do not use your fingers. Use a board. Use a guide." There's a reason for that, and it can happen faster than you realize. By cutting yourself with a pocket knife, you save yourself you learn the lesson that safety rules are important, and you don't learn that lesson on a table saw or even
You don't lose an arm
with
or
a
your
gun.
life. Yeah.
Right. So how do you do this? I would say first you start small, but I would also say start young. So you start with small things. You're not going to hand your children a sword at 3. That's a real sword, but start small, and I would say start young. Um, our children have been given pocket knives, I think, since 9 months before they were born by my dad.
Mhm.
But we collect those, put them in a drawer,
Yes.
and they're not allowed to use those. We didn't give them the pocket knife when they were 18 months old crawling around. But pretty early on, we have given each of them a pocket knife, a small one that they couldn't hurt themselves much with, and one that, very importantly for us, that a sibling couldn't get hurt with.
Mhm.
Because if you have, and do you remember? I don't remember. I have a number in mind, but I wanted to ask you when we actually put a pocket knife in our children's hands. What age?
I feel like 7.
I was thinking 8.
Yeah.
So it was definitely that 7 or 8
For
age
the
range.
oldest. Now,
Yes. Yeah.
Elizabeth
Marshall's
doesn't
5.
have one and Marshall
He
doesn't.
doesn't have one.
Yeah.
Elizabeth is 8 right now, and she doesn't have
Yeah.
one. She has one, but
But they don't have access to
she
them.
doesn't have access to it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think around 7 or 8 is when Jackson or Sawyer would be the youngest age that we put a pocket knife in somebody's hand.
Mhm.
And then how did we do that? What process or what rules did we lay out for them?
So it was definitely more of a formal giving.
Hmm.
This is a gift and then here are the parameters to that gift, and if you don't use it properly, it's coming back to us.
Yeah.
Like you have to show us that you know how to use this responsibly, and be mature with this, or it's going to go right back away from your hand.
And it did.
It did.
Multiple occasions where I said, "Okay, I take that back." Now these are very small pocket knives, and yes, you could get hurt with them, but you've got there are plenty of things around the house that are more dangerous than this pocket knife we're putting in their hand. And so one of the things that I said to the boys is I said, "I want to ask you at any time, where is that pocket knife? And I want you to be able to tell me."
Mhm.
So you find a place to put it away. You take it out when you need it. and you put it back in that place. And I want to at any time be able to say to you, "Where's that pocket knife?" And you say, "It's in that drawer right there." I open that drawer and it's in there. Now, a couple of times I found it and I just kind of put it in my pocket. "Hey, where's the pocket knife?" I don't know."
Mhm.
Yeah, well, I found it over here, so it's mine now,
Mhm.
and I'm going to keep it for a while. So that was one of the things that we did, is just to make sure they understand. Here's kind of a test, and if you can handle this, then we can increase the responsibility. Part of that is having younger siblings around. We've got to know that that's not going to be a dangerous thing for them.
Right.
So start with something small, give them clear rules about it, and then let them use it. I mean, just let them use it. Let them woodle or whittle, if and let them cut things. And don't be afraid if they cut themselves. They're probably going to cut themselves. And when they cut themselves, hey, what'd you learn? And have that happen. And all right, let's get some peroxide, or you know what, maybe some alcohol on it. Burn a little more. We'll bandage it up, and then at that point, if they broke a rule, you hold on to it. If they didn't break a rule, then just give it back to them. The cuts will probably do a lot more to teach them about safety than anything.
Right. I do think we our culture is increasingly that of attempting to remove consequences, natural
Hmm.
consequences from our children in order to try to prevent them from having
Any
pain
pain,
at all.
yeah.
And that is definitely to their detriment. And so this is a very safe way as parents that we can teach our children responsibility. We can teach them about natural consequences to breaking rules and even just to being negligent or, not being careful and how that can affect them and other people. So it is a great opportunity to teach them those things within a safe, environment and with not too much at risk there to do that.
Yeah. So that's with knives, and then of course, as they show responsibility, you increasingly give them knives. Another thing you can do, and we did this with both of our boys when we had very young children in the house, is they had nicer knives that had different things on them, and so they didn't get those all the time. But when we would go on camping trips or we go out to do something special, then I would pull the knife out and say, "Hey, you can have this because we're not going to be around the younger kids, or we're going to this cool camping trip, and your brother's not going to be there, so you can have this and show me that you can use it responsibly
Yeah.
and that you can take care of it." It's not just about safety; it's about taking care of a tool. So they're learning to take care of a tool, and so we've done that as well.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk for a minute about guns. Boy, that kind of really ramps it up.
Mhm.
Guns are much more dangerous. Um, I shot a gun, as I said earlier, at age 6. By 8 or 9, I was hunting snakes. Just me and my brother. We like to go snake hunting, and we were all by ourselves. I mean, nobody's with us. My brother was probably 10, I was 8, and we're out on the lake, hunting snakes. Um, shooting a gun at age 6 did something for me that I don't think could have happened any other way. Were you surprised? You're old enough. You were old enough to remember. Were you surprised how loud the gun was when you shot it?
Yes.
Okay, imagine that for a 6-year-old.
And powerful.
Powerful. Yep. So shooting a gun at 6 years old gave me the respect I needed for that weapon.
Mhm.
I mean, I got it from my dad, my grandfather, and everybody I was around had respect for guns. But you watch a western on TV, and I mean, they're shooting all these guns, and you think, well, that looks cool. Or you watch Star Wars, and they're blasting these lasers. That looks cool. But when you put that gun up against your arm and you pull the trigger and you hear it, it scares you. Of course, you don't act like you're scared,
Sure.
but you are scared. And there's a little bit of kick to it, even with a 22. For a 6-year-old, like, you realize I'm holding something powerful. I'm holding something dangerous. And so I think taking your kids out to the range, and shooting at an early age can be a very helpful thing.
Mhm.
Of course, you're there with all the safety precautions, but that was very helpful for me.
Yeah. And then, beyond an actual real gun, you've got most likely for children are BB guns or airsoft guns or paintball guns. And, we all think about the Christmas story with, you'll shoot your eye out with Ralph, and so even just this year, Marshall got his first BB gun,
Yeah.
and they've been learning gun safety with that. And so it's kind of like with the pocket knife, where if he's not careful and he accidentally points it the wrong way, it's not going to end someone's life.
Right.
It's what's the mistakes are not deadly. So that's helpful too, that you can learn to respect those
Hmm.
types of weaponry in that way, and learn to enjoy them as a sport in that way.
Looking back on my own childhood, and I would say this absolutely true of our children as well. Um, I was much more likely to seriously harm somebody with a BB gun
Mhm.
or pellet gun than I ever was with a real gun,
Mhm.
because there was just such a level of respect for those guns that I was not going to touch those guns.
Mhm.
That it just wasn't going to happen. And I like to tell people this who didn't grow up in kind of a gun culture. Um, I knew where all the guns were in my house. And they were in the main hallway of our house. They were in a gun cabinet that was right across from the main bathroom that we all use. I saw this gun cabinet every day of my life. It was locked, but the skeleton key was on top of the gun cabinet.
Mhm.
I knew that. Half the time, it was in the door of the gun. It was just in the lock. So there was no issue to get access to those guns. I wouldn't have touched those guns. I mean, to save my life, I wouldn't have touched those guns.
Right.
I just knew that was a no-go zone. And part of it was because I shot those guns
Mhm.
with my dad, and when I did, I knew. And then when I got old enough that my dad said, "Yeah, you can use this gun or you can use this gun." So when we were snake hunting, we were using shotguns. Shotguns are a little different. They're still dangerous, but they're a little different than rifles. So we were using shotguns with that. I don't think any snakes were actually in danger of being killed from our long distance shots. But anyway, we took them out, and we went hunting with them. And then as we got older, I even knew, opening that gun cabinet as, say, a 15-year-old, I knew which guns I could get out of that cabinet and use, and which ones I were off limits and
Yeah.
I couldn't touch.
Yeah.
So
There is an added level of responsibility with a setup like that when friends are over, that you make sure that, that that's safe and everything, because every family is different and you
yeah.
don't know what
All
they've
my
been
friends were
taught.
the same. I knew they weren't about to touch those guns
Right.
either. But now we don't have that, and that's not going to be a setup in our house where
Right.
we have all of our guns out. Where any kid can come in and see them. And I'm not saying that's the way you ought to do it,
Sure.
but I just wanted, as an example of how much respect we had,
Right.
for those guns. So I would say early, and then of course do it the right way. So just about any man who owns a gun knows the rules of safety. You treat every gun like it's loaded. You never point at anything you're not willing to shoot.
Yeah.
Those are the two most important rules.
And those rules we have been able to reinforce with our kids using the BB guns
Yep.
as well, because they're using those a lot more
Right.
frequently than they would go to a shooting range. I mean, maybe once a year we'll be able to take our kids to a shooting range at this point anyway in our life. We went on a camping trip about a year ago, and you guys got to go out to the range and do a little bit of that. But the BB gun thing is happening
Yeah.
all the time, in
Yeah.
the backyard with targets, and so that's a good way to constantly remind them of those rules of treat every gun like it's loaded and don't point it at something you're not willing to shoot. And so they have that ingrained in their mind.
Yeah. And those, I mean, if you follow those two simple rules, um, I mean, gun safety is set,
Mhm.
right? So, and you walk them through that every single time, and just to dads who, even with a BB gun, that's the time. So you hold the end of that barrel on a BB
Mhm.
gun while you're helping them get it all set up, I feel like men are not going to struggle to know how to do this, but uh, they get the gun, you help them, and you make a big deal out of it. You put the safety on so that they got to take the safety off, they got to pull the trigger, and then 100% of 6-year-old little boys are gonna, after they shoot it, they're gonna swing that gun around and say, "Did you see that? That was awesome." They're gonna love it, and you're gonna grab the end of that barrel as they swing it around, and you're gonna say, "Hey, we never point at anything we're not willing to shoot, and we treat every gun like it's loaded.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's try this again." And they do it again, and then inevitably you're gonna see them out there shooting at the house or something, and you're gonna say, "All right, the gun's mine for a while," and so you take the gun up, and then they get it back, and so they learn on that. While I think at the same time shooting a real gun and being a a little bit afraid of it. Um, and then of course there's the rules are different with airsoft and paintball because you are shooting at people, and you're teaching them to shoot at people. But that's a little bit of a different story.
Yeah. So, whether it's knives or whether it's guns, and even with the knives, I think it's not just pocket knives, but you've got kitchen knives, especially our
Yeah,
girls, they're more frequently going to be using kitchen knives and things like that that could be dangerous. No matter what tool or potential weapon we're talking about with helping children learn how to both respect it and use it, it's our role as parents to help them understand that they are responsible for their time with these things, and they are responsible for the what ifs, and
yeah,
they've got to be really careful, but they also, they don't have to be afraid of it to the point of not using these things, but they also there's a purpose to these tools and these weapons, and just that level of respect. We just can't overemphasize that level of respect for these things. And what we wouldn't want to do is to shield our children from these things to the point where when they are older and they are exposed to them,
right,
there's a level of intrigue or
right,
mystery to them, and they don't know how to handle them. They don't know how to deal with them. And then I think the other thing that comes along with it is just like what we spoke about at the beginning, different contexts are going to have different parameters. And so that overarching concept of respect for authority comes into play here. And so, there are some places where guns are not allowed or knives are not allowed, weapons are not allowed. When we go to the federal courthouse for our mock trial for Challenge B,
yeah.
you can't accidentally bring your pocket knife in there. You're going to get in trouble. We went to a sporting event
Saw
and
your lost a pocket knife.
saw your lost a pocket knife because we waited. In the
Oh, we were in
long,
that
long,
line for so
long,
long.
long line, we get up to the front, and the guy's doing the security, and he didn't get caught. Sawyer just pulled the knife out of his pocket and said, "Hey, can I bring this in?" And we're like, "Oh, buddy." So, lost that knife. But
Yeah,
so, just understanding that there are different rules and there are different authorities
yeah,
on these types of
absolutely.
things. And so we need to be respectful of those things as well. And different contexts in different countries and different environments, those are all things to consider. And definitely that concept of submitting to authority is
Right.
really, really important in that.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of American in us, right, that goes, well, that doesn't matter what they say to me. Okay, well, work to change the laws or work to change the policies or whatever. I remember in New York City a few years ago, it's been maybe 20 years ago, there was a young man who he was an Eagle Scout back when that meant something. And he, no offense to current guys who are working through Eagle Scouts, I just have my beef with the larger organization that in the direction they've gone. But he was arrested because he had a pocket knife on the subway.
Wow.
And I remember that case. And now, so what do you do in that? You say, well, I will submit to the local authorities. I didn't, I'm sure he didn't know that it was illegal to have a pocket knife there. But and that's the case, I'll do that. But then I'm going to work to change the laws. Why can't I have my Swiss Army knife? I'm a Boy Scout. Why can't I have my Swiss Army knife on the subway? And so but we're not going to go out and be rebels
Right.
and that kind of American thing in us of you're not going to take my guns, you're not going to take my knives. Like there's a place for that, but that's in the arena of politics. That's not necessarily in the arena of Christian living and a Christ-centered life. So if you get called to be a missionary to a country where they don't allow weapons, then you leave your weapons at home.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the sacrifice that God has called you to make.
Yeah.
And another thing I want to say, I want to be really clear, is parents, it's our responsibility to keep guns put away in safe places.
Yeah.
You said something earlier about if you don't expose them and then later on in life they do see it. Unfortunately, that's been the issue with a lot of accidental shootings.
Mm-hmm.
And a kid who's never been exposed to guns sees a gun, thinks it's really neat, and just doesn't know how to deal with it.
Right.
And that's really, really sad.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a tragedy. You can't stop accidental shootings. I know that most most shootings inside of a home are actually accidental. So very rarely does somebody break in a home and you have to shoot that person. Most of the time, a shooting inside of a home is accidental, um, and that's a very sad reality. So you want to make sure that your guns are put up, that they're locked away. If you do keep a gun loaded for security purposes, then you keep it in a place that's locked that only you can get to. And well, I've got to be quick. I've got to be able to move quickly. Well, I think the risk is very small that you're going to need that, and the risk is very high that especially if you have young kids in the home, that they might find it
Mhm.
and might use it. So just be very, very careful about how you store your guns and keeping them locked away.
Yeah. So one of the practical things that we've done with this is we've told our kids, if you ever see anything that looks like a gun and you know it's not yours, like you know it's not your toy gun, don't touch it. Go ask an adult, tell the adult, and let them be the one to handle that. So if you're at somebody's house and you see something that looks like a gun and you know it's not a toy, you know it's not your toy that you brought, let an adult know because you touching it, it might be a gun. It might be a
Yeah.
real gun, and so especially with things like our family loves airsoft, and so those guns look real.
Hmm.
They look like the real thing, and so there is that risk that a kid thinks it's a toy gun or they think it's an airsoft gun, and it's not.
All the more reason I think you should expose your kids to real guns
Right.
because I guarantee that our older boys and probably even Meredith, you lay out three guns, and airsoft guns are designed to look identical to the real thing.
Mhm.
But you lay those three guns out, and I know our two boys can say that's an airsoft gun, that's a real gun,
Mhm.
because they work differently. The magazines are different, and,
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. But looking, you wouldn't know at those guns. You just have to look at how they work and operate and all that to be able to tell. And they're going to know. And the other thing is, it's happened here where we've had someone leave a gun on property, and in that moment, I mean, that's a very dangerous situation. Hopefully, you have children who understand and respect the danger of those guns. One of the ways that they're going to do that is through training.
Mhm.
And so you train them that from an early age. You expose them to that age appropriate ways, and that's what we've done. Now, again, every family's got to take their course of action that works for them, but
Mhm.
we just wanted to share kind of what we've done with those things. I want to make sure that we go through some ages. So around 5 or 6 is when each of our kids has gotten a BB gun. I think Elizabeth was the oldest one to get a BB gun. She got one at 8.
But she wasn't asking for one
Right.
either. Like, I do think that kind of comes into play. You have to
Hmm.
consider, are they desiring to
Yeah,
do
we
that?
weren't trying
Like,
to keep it from her. It
right.
just
She
kind of
just
didn't happen.
didn't care to have one until this year. So,
Um, Airsoft guns, we've bought airsoft guns for kids, or they've bought them for themselves. I would say like 10 or 11, that age that has more to do with when they're really old enough to play. And
hmm,
yeah, Marshall can shoot a BB gun, but he's not old enough to get shot by an airsoft gun
right.
because it hurts. So that's the age for that that we've used. Um, Real guns, I think by 7, 8 years old, it would be good to take them out to a shooting range and have them shoot a small caliber gun. And then by 9 or 10, if they're interested in guns, especially, get them to a shooting range and let them shoot a rifle. I mean, one of our favorite family videos is the first time that one of our children, we won't say who, shot a rifle, and he did everything the right way. Everything was good, but it almost knocked him off the stool. So he was sitting on
It
a
knocked his
stool,
headphones off.
knocked his headphones
It
off,
knocked
and
his
so
glasses off.
so it's one of our favorite family videos. But around that age, take them out to a shooting range and let them shoot a gun, and get them around some law enforcement people who can teach them some tips and help them understand how dangerous this is, and so those are some ages.
And then again with the pocket knife, usually around 7 or
Yeah,
8
around 7 or
is
8 is,
for
is
a
when we give them that
for a
small
small one.
pocket knife.
Mhm.
So when they get unrestricted control of pocket knives, like, okay, here are your pocket knives. I mean, you want to wait till they're 12, 13
And that
to
really
do that.
depends on the kid too.
Sure,
If you've got a
absolutely.
child who's reckless and who's not thinking through and not
Yeah.
following the rules, then just because they turn 12 or 13 doesn't mean you hand that over, right? So you have to look at that individually and say, are they responsible with these things? How are they using these
Hmm.
things? We have one in particular who would prefer to use the pocket knife to do everything
Right,
and
brush his teeth.
right, cut his chicken at the dinner
Sure.
table, and that's just not going to work.
And
So,
also, there's the issue with siblings. So there were only two of us, my brother and I. And I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, like, by 12 or 13, they have kind of unlimited access. I think probably by the time I was 8, I had knives running out of my ears, and, I had not only pocket knives, but sheath knives and that kinda thing, but there were no younger children in the house,
Right.
so if I left a knife laying around, then there's not a 3-year-old that might get it
Right.
and do harm.
And your older brother was raised by wolves.
That's true.
So
Well, no, he tried to convince me that we both were raised
oh,
by
okay.
wolves, so, maybe that's a podcast for another day, but he really tried to convince me of that, and I kept thinking, "Well, how did those baby pictures get here?" But he told me, that we were both raised by wolves and that the mama wolf dropped us off along with our dog Tracks in our
Mhm.
backyard, and that's how we came to live with our parents. Now, as older brothers have amazing mind control
Oh,
over younger
absolutely.
brothers. I kept thinking, I know that can't be true because I remember when we went to get our dog. Like, I remember going to get our dog, but maybe I'm not remembering that the right way? So, anyway.
I have a very, like, Mowgli view in
Yeah.
my mind of the 2 of y'all, like, that he created this whole
Sure.
backstory of the 2 of y'all being raised in the wilderness by the wolves
Yep.
and come to the man village and
Sure.
and
Sure.
assimilate into their life.
But hey, look at us, raised by wolves, and we turned out okay.
Yeah.